Eccellenza, carissimi amici, sono molto felice di accogliervi stasera nella nostra università per ascoltare la conferenza del padre John O'Malley sul Concilio di Trento. Stiamo vivendo a Roma giorni eccezionali con l'inizio del conclave. Non è soltanto un momento di elezione per i cardinali e di attesa per noi, è un tempo molto significativo e di alta portata nella vita della nostra Chiesa, una Chiesa che si affida, specialmente stasera, nella preghiera allo Spirito Santo per illuminare i cardinali adesso riuniti nella Cappella Sistina. Proprio quando viviamo questo periodo, abbiamo la fortuna stasera di volgere gli occhi verso questo altro evento della vita della Chiesa, che è stato il Concilio di Trento. Come tutti voi sapete, celebriamo questo anno il 450° anniversario della fine del Concilio di Trento, il 4 dicembre 1563. Il padre John O'Malley ha appena pubblicato un libro sul Concilio di Trento che si intitola Trent, What Happened at the Council. We are very privileged indeed and honored to have you, John, for this conference. Father John O'Malley is a very well-known scholar, theologian, and historian. His bibliography is very impressive, and therefore it's better not to repeat what you can read on the sheet of paper you have picked up at the entrance. And I would like to stress only a few points. Father John O'Malley is a native from Ohio, a specialist in the religious culture of early modern Europe, especially Italy. He is presently a university professor in the theology department at Georgetown University. His best-known book is The First Jesuits, that has been published by Harvard University Press 20 years ago and translated into 10 languages. I would like also to mention Four Cultures of the West, published in 2004, What Happened at Vatican II, published in 2008, and A History of the Pope, 2009, that have been translated into Italian. Among many honors, he was elected in 1995 to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, in 1997 to the American Philosophical Society, and in 2001 to the Accademia di San Carlo at Milano. Father John O'Malley is not only one of the brightest scholars we can meet, read, and listen to, he is also, and I can speak from my own experience, he is also a delightful and charming person. If you have not read one of his books, I encourage you strongly to do so. It's always clear and precise, lively and scholarly, extensive in its knowledge of its subject matter, deep in the analysis and insights, and fascinating from beginning to end. It's really wonderful, John, to have you this evening, and thank you very much for having answered our invitation so kindly and promptly.
Quindi parlo in inglese. I will speak in English. It's a great honor for me. I thank Father Rector for inviting me to be the presider at this wonderful occasion when Professor John O'Malley speaks to us about the Council of Trent. Obviously, the Council of Trent has had enormous influence upon the Catholic Church and the Christian churches more widely. It was the For 300 years there was no further council until Vatican I, and the program of Trent, you might say, dominated Catholic life, Catholic thought for 3 centuries or more. So it's an extremely important topic, and we're very honoured that Professor John O'Malley should come and speak to us, come all the way from the United States. John has a very long connection with Italy. Father Rector mentioned his books, but perhaps just add that his early work, in fact, was on the period a little before Trent, Giles of Viterbo and the Fifth Lateran Council, and the period leading up to the Reformation. So he has a unique advantage in that he understands the period very well before Trent, and so understands the council in especially illuminating way. I think that's all I'd like to say. John is, as Rector has said, is extremely well known, and he has written on all the dimensions of the 16th century and Counter-Reformation and the Jesuits in particular, and will surely give us a wonderfully erudite and also broad appreciation of this great council, which has had so much importance in the life of the Church, and indeed, in a sense, the background for all of us. So, John, just to introduce the program for today, John will now give his lecture, and at the end there will be time for questions, of course, and there will be refreshments at the end, as is appropriate. So I'd like to introduce John again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father de Mortier and Norman. We're all old friends, and it's a great honor for me to be here. Father de Mortier mentioned my books. I might say that one of the questions my friends always ask me when a new book's published is they want to know on what pages are the jokes. So the Council of Trent, myths, misunderstandings, and unintended consequences. Since it closed in 1563, exactly 450 years ago, the Council of Trent, perhaps more than many other important historical events, has suffered from myths and misunderstandings. I say perhaps more than many others for a number of reasons. Among them was the fact that the Council was an object of vicious controversy and polemic even before it opened, by Catholics as well as by Protestants. Then, the Catholic kings of France threw obstacle after obstacle in this way, and in effect boycotted it until the last moment. The fact, moreover, that the Council dragged on for an interminable 18 years made it an object of derision and satire by both Catholics and Protestants. Contributing to the problem was the fact that its final documents are dense with theological and canonical technicalities that make them extraordinarily susceptible to misunderstanding except by specialists skilled in the subtleties of canon law and medieval scholasticism. There's a further problem. Shortly after the Council concluded in 1563, Pope Pius IV confirmed its decrees, but he forbade the printing of commentaries or notes on them without the explicit permission of the Holy See. That decree was never formally rescinded. Then, in the early 17th century, Pope Paul V collected into 50 volumes all the materials related to the Council that were available to him and stored them in the Vatican archives under the heading Fondo Concilio. Those archives were private, closed to scholars. The restrictions on access and on commentary made comprehensive scholarship and research on the Council of Trent impossible. That situation changed only in 1880, when Pope Leo XIII opened the Vatican archives. Shortly thereafter, the Gesellschaft, the learned society founded in 1876 by German Catholic scholars, went to work to produce a critical edition of the documents pertinent to the Council. The first volume appeared in 1901. The final volume in 2001, precisely a century after the first. Those huge 18 tomes, some of which run to 800 or 900 pages, principally in Latin and Italian, but with sprinkling of other languages, finally provided the basis for dispelling the myths and misunderstandings that have enshrouded the Council of Trent. What they revealed, however, was how complex the Council was and how many of the skills needed to untangle the sources that were now finally available. The hero of the story is Hubert Jedin, a member of the Gesellschaft, who in 1949 published in German the first volume of his History of the Council, Geschichte des Konzils von Trient. He published the fourth and final volume some 25 years later in 1975. Everybody who today writes on the Council is heavily indebted to him, not only for the history, but for his many other writings on the Council. In the course of close to a century that has elapsed since the 1930s, when Jedin first began to publish on the Council, his work, not surprisingly, has shown its limitations. Still, the large corpus of his writings has held up remarkably well. Jedin's writings are, however, all in German. The first 4 volumes of his history were translated into both Italian and Spanish, but only the first 2 into English and only the first into French. There are no other translations into any other languages, as best I've been able to ascertain. Moreover, Jedin's many and extremely important articles on the Council remained locked away in their original language. Jedin dispelled many of the myths and misunderstandings, but for much of the world, even for much of the scholarly world, he did so to little avail. With full acknowledgement of my debt to Jedin, I will this evening try to correct a few of the myths and misunderstandings. I divide what I have to say into 3 parts as promised by my title. I will first address some major myths, then some common misunderstandings, and finally describe 3 major consequences of the Council that it did not intend. Before I go any further, I perhaps first need to recall for you some of the basic facts about the Council. Only after contentious negotiations did the interested parties settle on the then small city of Trent as the Council's location, a compromise fully agreeable to none of them. Contention over the location presaged many of the other disagreements and conflicts of priorities that plagued the Council from its first moment until its last. The Council met over the course of 5 pontificates in 3 distinct periods, 1545 to 47, 1551 to 52, and 1562 to 63. This long trajectory meant that very few of the bishops and theologians who opened the Council in 1545 were still alive or well enough to participate in the final period that opened 17 years later. As in previous councils, secular monarchs were present at Trent through their ambassadors, who made the concerns of their sovereigns known and operative in the Council's deliberations. The Council of Trent was not a sacristy affair. Its outcome had serious political as well as religious consequences for all concerned. With that very brief setting, we can begin with the first of the 3 myths. By myth, I mean here simply a widely held but misleading belief or opinion. It is different from a simple mistake or misinterpretation in that it tends to have an overarching significance and to rise to a high level of generalization. Myth number 1. The Council of Trent was essentially aimed at repression and social discipline. There is evidence to support this myth. Exhibit number 1 is the fact that during the 3rd period, the Council worked at elaborating a new index of forbidden books. Exhibit number 2 is the famous decree of the Council entitled Tam et Si, that for the first time required that Catholic marriages be witnessed by a priest, an incursion into the spouse's freedom to exchange vows when and how they wanted. The 3rd exhibit is the fact that during the so-called Counter-Reformation, or Tridentine era, the Spanish, Papal, and other Inquisitions launched campaigns of surveillance and imposed restrictions to a degree unknown before the Council. The Council must be responsible. Before addressing those issues, I must first put the Council into perspective. First of all, from the very beginning until Vatican II, councils conducted their business as legislative and judicial bodies. That is, they made laws and heard criminal cases. The laws had to do with public conduct, and they were usually, but not always, aimed at the clergy and were intended in most cases to correct abuses. Laws are by definition a restriction of freedom, which is justified only in view of a greater good. Trent passed a lot of laws because the council deemed them necessary for the badly needed reform of the church. What is peculiar about Trent, and seldom commented upon, is that the bishops at Trent aimed their reform principally at themselves. A moral miracle, I would say. There were two glaring abuses in the episcopacy. The first was absenteeism. Before the council, for instance, Milan, the largest, richest, and most important archdiocese in Italy, had not had a resident archbishop for 40 years. The second was holding more than one bishopric at a time, so as to collect more revenue than one bishopric alone yielded. The great struggle at Trent was to enact the most stringent legislation possible to correct these blatant abuses. The aim was a more pastorally responsive episcopate. The disciplinary decrees of the Council of Trent in the aggregate deal almost exclusively with this problem and with its correlate, making sure pastors of parishes also reside in their parishes and do their traditional jobs. Very little of Tridentine legislation deals directly with the laity. What about the index of forbidden books that the council tried to elaborate? In 1559, the year of his death, Pope Paul IV issued the first papal index. It was so extreme that his successor, Pius IV, felt obliged to set up a commission to mitigate it. In the meantime, Pius convoked the council's third period. For reasons too complicated to go into here, the council could not immediately take up its agenda from where it had left off 10 years earlier. It needed to spin its wheels for a while until a crucial procedural question could be resolved. The Pope hit on the idea of transferring the revision of the index from the commission he had originally established and to give the job to the council, almost as something to keep it busy until it could address the real issues. Many members of the council objected to the idea. Revision of the index was a waste of the council's time, the council did not have the resources to do it, and so forth. Nonetheless, the council in effect had little choice. In any case, we must remember the revision was undertaken to mitigate the index, not in any way to make it stronger. The council was, in fact, unable to complete its work on the index. What was published after the council as the Tridentine Index of Forbidden Books was never discussed or approved by the council, even though a committee of the council had provided the basic materials for it. The decree Tamezzi, requiring a priest witness for the validity of a marriage entered into by Catholics, was the one decree of Trent that had immediate impact on the laity. Was it a typical power grab by the church, as it is sometimes portrayed, and an instance of Trent's unwarranted disciplining of the laity? The answer to both these questions is negative. Everyone at Trent, indeed all Christian theologians, Protestants and Catholics alike, agree that the essence of marriage was the exchange of vows between the two partners. Why then did Trent think it necessary to issue a decree on the matter? It did so to try to solve the problem of so-called clandestine marriages. That is, the exchange of vows between the two partners without any witnesses present whatsoever. What this often meant was that a few years or a few babies later, one of the partners, usually the man, could deny that the marriage had ever taken place and move on to a new spouse. Trent's decree was meant to protect the innocent spouse, usually the woman, so that the other spouse could not, without further ado, abandon the marriage. It was to put a stop to this abuse that the council after heated debate, decided on taumetsi. What about inquisitions? The first thing to note is that in their Spanish, Roman, and Venetian forms, they all antedate the Council of Trent. The Spanish Inquisition did so by a half century. The second thing to note is that the Council of Trent neither commended nor condemned them. It said not a word about them. If the Council was somehow responsible for their greater stringency after the Council, that responsibility was indirect and, as far as our evidence goes, unintended. Myth number 2. The Council exacerbated the religious division. As with all myths, this one contains more than a grain of truth. With hindsight, we see clearly that in its doctrinal decrees, the Council drew a sharp line of demarcation on the contested issues, especially on the sacraments. To deal adequately with this myth, we must make the crucial distinction between what the Council intended to do or thought it was doing and how it was interpreted or employed after the Council. We tend to forget that the Council was meant to be and hoped to be a council of reconciliation with the reformers. That was the primary purpose that Emperor Charles V had in mind as he, for a full decade, tried to persuade first Pope Clement VII and then Pope Paul III to convoke the council. Although Paul III and his successors were skeptical that such a reconciliation could be effected by the council, they nonetheless subscribed to that goal. As a gesture of goodwill, Paul III, at the very beginning of the council, directed that no one was to be condemned by name. This was contrary to the practice of every council up to that time. Moreover, strenuous efforts were made to have representative Lutherans and others come to the council to defend their positions. And in fact, a few Lutherans did appear toward the end of the second period, 1551 to 52. By then, however, it was decades too late. Lutheranism had by that time become a full religious system, and it was a system incompatible with Catholicism. Even with this setback, Pius IV, when he years later convoked the third period, still made efforts that today we might even call ecumenical. On December the 1st, 1560, he sent a letter to the Lutheran princes in Germany inviting them to send envoys to the council. In early February, 2 papal legates appeared before them to ask their support for the council. In May 1561, the papal nuncio, Girolamo Martinenko, bore an invitation to the council for Queen Elizabeth of England, but he was denied entrance to the kingdom. Most surprisingly, Pius dispatched legates to the Coptic Patriarch in Alexandria, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch in Constantinople or Istanbul, and to the Armenian Patriarch in Antioch. His several attempts to reach the Russian Patriarch in Moscow were obstructed by the Poles. None of these efforts, of course, bore fruit. Myth number 3. The Council of Trent was a monochromatic, well-disciplined, and single-minded meeting that legislated on every important aspect of Catholicism. Yadin's writings showed how contrary to the fact this myth was, but despite his efforts, it still persists. From its opening days, the bishops showed their independence and continued to challenge every effort to make them conform to some preconceived program. The bishops and theologians participating in the council reflected the wide and diverse range of positions on almost every aspect of Catholic teaching and practice that characterized European Catholicism at the time. The council was, therefore, a contentious and extraordinarily difficult meeting. It lurched from major crisis to major crisis. For a period of 10 months, from September 1562 until July 1563, it was so paralyzed that it could not issue a single decree. Nor did the council try to legislate on every important aspect of Catholicism. As I've already mentioned that it abstained from any mention of inquisitions. More surprisingly, from a 21st century perspective, it had not a word to say about foreign missions, even though the evangelization of the newly discovered lands had already become one of Catholicism's most distinctive and defining features, and without doubt, an enterprise of immense import for the future of the Church. Nor did the Council say anything about war, about Renaissance humanism, as well as about many other things. The Council of Trent had a very straightforward and clearly focused agenda: affirmation of Catholic doctrine on the contested issues, and reform of three offices in the Church: the papacy, the episcopacy, and the pastorate. There are surely other myths concerning the Council, but we must move on to misunderstandings or misinterpretations or misinformation. These differ from myths in that they are very specific and, as single issues, lack the overarching range that is peculiar to myth. They are not for that reason, however, less important for understanding certain issues that are lively within Catholicism today. In fact, they in that regard may be more important than myths. Number one, the Council of Trent forbade the use of the vernacular in the liturgy. The Council issued only a single line on that issue. Quotation, "It is wrong to say that the liturgy must always be celebrated in the vernacular." Wrong to say that the liturgy must always be celebrated in the vernacular. In other words, Latin was legitimate, but not required. Surprisingly, from our perspective today, the possibility of vernacular liturgy sparked little controversy in the Council. The bishops seemed to agree with one of their colleagues, who reminded them that in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, liturgies were celebrated, as he said, in every language under the sun. As far as the legislation of Trent was concerned, vernacular liturgy was not a problem. Long before the Council ended, however, the Latin liturgy had become such a sign of Catholic identity vis-a-vis the Protestants that the Council's openness on the issue never had a chance to become operative. Number two, the Council forbade the printing, selling, and reading of Bibles in the vernacular. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century had resulted almost immediately in the diffusion of Bibles in the vernacular. Luther's brilliant translation into German was just the most famous, but far from being the first. At the Council, opinions differed sharply about what to do in the face of this relatively new reality. For some bishops, vernacular Bibles were the root of all heresies, whereas for others, they were the essential nourishment for the godly life. For the Council, the problem had political ramifications. In France and Spain, as well as England, such translations had long been forbidden, even though they circulated in those places rather freely. If the Council advocated them, the episcopacy and probably the crown would countermand the decree. If it forbade them, Germany, Italy, Poland, and other places where they were allowed would react just as negatively, but for the opposite reason. The Council decided not to decide and left the question open. That was in 1546. But as mentioned, during the third period, the Council undertook a revision of the Index of Paul IV. In the committee's recommendations, it provided norms for episcopal surveillance of vernacular translations and restrictions on reading them. These rules were then incorporated into the Index issued after the Council in the Council's name. Remember, however, that the Council itself never saw these rules, nor did it ever discuss them. Number three, the Council forbade all Latin translations except the Vulgate. As you know, the Vulgate was the Latin translation done principally by St. Jerome in the early 5th century that eventually became the standard version in the West. As you also know, the Council of Trent declared that version authentic. What did the Council intend by that declaration? By the time the Council met, the Vulgate had come under scathing criticism from scholars newly schooled in critical philology, beginning with Lorenzo Valla, a good century before Trent met. As a result, several new translations were in circulation, which the best known was Erasmus' translation of the New Testament into Latin. Many of the bishops at Trent were keenly aware of the problems with the Vulgate and were favorable towards one or other of the new translations. But the council needed to settle the practical question of what version to use in its deliberations. If they were to choose a text other than the Vulgate, which would it be? Were the problems with the Vulgate so serious as to prevent its use in the council and in the church at large? The council in the end decided, almost as a practical measure, to use the Vulgate, which it deemed authentic. If I may translate that, reliable, or even reliable enough. It also decreed that it be thoroughly revised so as to make it conform with the best philological standards. The crucial intervention on this issue at the council was made by Bishop Pietro Bertano, a member of the commission who drafted the decree. In the name of the commission, he explained, "We do not consider it an abuse that there are various and different translations of the Bible, because it was tolerated in ancient times and should be tolerated today. We wish the Vulgate edition to be accepted as authentic, but we do not reject other versions because we do not want to restrict Christian liberty. Moreover, we do not want even to reject the translations by heretics in conformity with the example of the ancient church." At the time of the decree, Pope Paul III and his advisors were dismayed by the council's statement on the Vulgate and let the legates know they thought the council was far too soft on it. After the council, however, the decree was taken as warrant for outlawing other translations, and the definite article, "the," became attached to the Vulgate. It became the authentic version. But of course, Latin has neither definite nor indefinite articles. The council said simply that the Vulgate was authentic, that is, reliable, could be used. Use it as a basis. Number 4. There is such a thing as a Tridentine liturgy sanctioned by the council. Today, there is much confusion on the question of Tridentine liturgy and the role of the council in that regard. The truth is that there is, in fact, no such thing as a Tridentine liturgy, in the sense that the council created a liturgy or substantially revised the traditional liturgy of the Roman Rite, or even issued anything that we today could recognize as a decree on the liturgy. The bishops and theologians at Trent simply accepted the different liturgies in use at the time of the council, of which by far the most prevalent in the West since the 13th century was the Roman Rite, which was originally the rite used by the Roman Curia. What the bishops were concerned about that rite was the sad state of its liturgical books. They were concerned in particular about the textual discrepancies in the many editions of the Missal that were then in circulation. Since the invention of printing, publishers had turned out missals in large numbers in which local interpolations and typographical errors were rife. In some cases, this might mean failing to print important parts of the text. This in turn meant that priests, out of ignorance, sometimes went so far as to eliminate the Our Father or other important prayers. The council briefly debated the problem, but took no action on it until the very last day of the council, December the 4th, 1563, when it recommended, almost as a two-word tag-on to a larger decree, that the Missal and Breviary be corrected. Those few words constituted the liturgical reform of the Council of Trent. After the council, the Pope confided supervision of the revision to the capable hands of Cardinal Guglielmo Sileto, who produced just what the council intended, a reliable text that conformed to the best and oldest manuscripts and printed editions. The text itself is perhaps less important than the bull of Pius V promulgating it, which ordered the universal adoption of the Roman Rite unless another rite had prevailed in a given region or institution for over 200 years. Missing from the bull is any intimation that a vernacular adaptation might be possible. Number 5. The council decreed that priests had to be celibate. In the Western Church, celibacy of the clergy early became an ideal, and it soon began to be required of everybody in major orders, that is, from deacon through priesthood and episcopacy. Observance of that discipline was always far from perfect. The issue erupted into open controversy in the 11th century with the Gregorian Reform, and then again in the 16th with the Reformation. Luther declared celibacy unwarranted by the Bible and an instance of papal tyranny over consciences. Other Protestant reformers followed his lead. It was almost inevitable then that the issue be raised at the council, especially when in the third period the council debated the sacraments of matrimony and holy orders. Responsible, however, for explicitly raising the matter were the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand I, the successor to Charles V. He was seconded by Duke Albrecht V of Bavaria. Early in the third period of the council, Ferdinand's ambassadors handed the papal legates a memorandum from him. In it, the emperor recommended a number of things. Among the more urgent was mitigation of celibacy. The legates took no action on the memorandum at that time. Some weeks later, however, Sigismund Baumgartner, a layman, arrived at the council as the ambassador of Duke Albrecht. According to standard protocol for such occasions, the ambassador addressed the council to convey to it the concerns of his sovereign. Citing information gathered from an extensive visitation of Bavaria in 1558, Baumgartner painted a dark picture. The vast majority of the clergy was ignorant and infected with heresy. Out of 100, only 3 or 4 were not secretly married or keeping concubines, to the great scandal of the faithful. Baumgartner pleaded on behalf of Albrecht for permission for the clergy to marry. He made the point that in German-speaking lands, devout and faithful Catholics had come to the conclusion that a chaste marriage is preferable to a tainted celibacy. The situation would deteriorate further, he predicted, unless, in accordance with the custom of the early church, well-educated men who were married were admitted to holy orders. He added, "It is, after all, not a divine law that requires priests to be celibate. As is clear from the historical record, married men were admitted to holy orders in past ages, and not only to the dignity of priesthood, but even to the exalted heights of the episcopacy." As was its practice, the council issued a formal acknowledgement of the address, but then moved on to the business at hand. Some months later, Duke Albrecht, through 2 envoys he sent to Rome, asked Pius IV directly for permission for upright and learned married men to perform certain ecclesiastical duties, especially preaching the divine word. The Pope replied that he would refer the matter to the legates at the council. When the legates received the Pope's inquiry, they consulted 4 theologians, who replied that the request was against the tradition of the Church and, in their opinion, inexpedient even for these calamitous times. For the time being, the issue rested there. Many months later, Georg Raskowitz, Emperor Ferdinand's ambassador, addressed the council on the issue. He reminded the bishops of the grave scandal priests caused by their sexual misconduct and said, "If you want young priests, let them get married first." Strange to say, his intervention sparked virtually no discussion. For better or worse, celibacy lacked urgency for bishops from Italy and Spain, who made up the vast majority of the bishops at Trent. In the final document on the sacrament of matrimony, celibacy is neither commended nor condemned. It is simply not mentioned. The council once again decided not to decide. 2 canons, however, dance around the issue. Canon 10 condemned the view that marriage was a more blessed state than virginity or celibacy. Canon 9 condemned the view that clerics in holy orders or religious who had taken a solemn vow of chastity could validly contract marriage. This was a minimal statement, more juridical than theological, that sidestepped the real issue. After the council, the matter landed on the desk of Pope Pius IV. The emperor and the duke continued their quest for a mitigation of celibacy, at least for German-speaking lands. Ferdinand, for instance, wrote to a number of the cardinals who he thought might influence Pius in his favor. After Ferdinand's death, his son Maximilian II continued the effort, as did Albrecht. Pius, undecided, in early January 1565, about a year after the conclusion of the council, created a deputation of cardinals to deliberate on the matter. 2 months later, King Philip II of Spain let the Pope know that he was utterly opposed to any concession. He argued that if a change were made for Bavaria and the Empire, other nations would demand it, which would result in the destruction of the Church's hierarchical structure. In the few months left to him before his death, Pius procrastinated. But when his successor, Pius V, let it be known immediately upon his election that he was determined to grant no concession or to admit any change, the issue died. Now, unintended consequences. Unintended consequences are consequences, good or bad, of a decision that was not foreseen at the time the decision was made. I will describe 3 of them concerning Trent. The first 2 were consequences for Catholic culture in the broad sense of the term. The last was a consequence that directly affected the papacy, but then deeply affected the trajectory of the history of the Catholic Church from that point forward. The first, the Catholic penchant for so emphasizing continuity in the history and tradition of the Church as virtually to dismiss or minimize any discontinuity. The Council of Trent unwittingly gave powerful impetus to a distinctively Catholic bias regarding the past that had in fact begun to emerge even before the Council. The Protestant reformers accused the Catholic Church of having completely broken with the gospel. For Luther, the fact that the Church did not preach justification by faith alone, as he understood it, meant that the true teaching of the New Testament had been ruptured. Moreover, by its exaltation of the papacy and the sanction of papal tyranny, the Church had broken radically with the teaching of Christ and the apostles. Catholic apologists immediately rushed to counter that charge, insisting upon the Church's unbroken continuity with the apostolic era. By the way Trent spoke, especially of the sacraments, it seconded the point the apologists made. In Canon 6 of its decree on the sacrament of penance, for instance, the Council asserted that from the beginning, the Church had required the secret confession of one's sins to a priest, in conformity with the command of Christ. As we know, however, that practice developed a century later in monasteries and became widespread in the West only in the 11th and 12th centuries. When the Council affirmed that in the Catholic Church, the ancient... That's it. You better stay. When the Council affirmed that in the Catholic Church, the ancient, absolute, in every respect, perfect faith and doctrine of the Eucharist had been retained, it was only making fully explicit for one aspect of its teaching what generally underlay its doctrinal pronouncements. No previous council ever insisted so often and so explicitly on its teaching's continuity with the authentic Christian past, and you understand the reason for that. In so doing, the council helped develop the Catholic mindset reluctant to admit change in the course of church tradition. Although there is certainly a profound sense in which Catholics can and must subscribe to the Church's claim of continuity, in its undifferentiated form, it flies in the face of incontestable evidence. In any case, a particularly Catholic mindset in that regard became more fully crystallized some decades after the Council with the publication of works like Cardinal Cesare Baronio's Ecclesiastical Annals, which was a response to Lutheran histories that tried to prove the thesis that Catholicism represented a break with the apostolic era and with the primitive church. That mindset persists to this day. Number 2. Partially as a consequence of Trent, Catholicism emerged as the most sensuous of the post-Reformation churches. Long before the Reformation, devout Christians reacted against the crass superstition, even carnal character of many religious practices of the day, and sought a more genuine religious experience. That is to say, they thought a religion that was more spiritual than what they saw around them. Erasmus, the great humanist of the early 16th century, contributed to this movement by his satires about phony relics, credulous pilgrims, and questionable apparitions of the Virgin Mary and other saints. He and other humanists like him sought a more spiritual religion that distanced itself from the sensuous, especially in its grosser and more ostentatious forms. Only with the Reformation, however, did this trend take a destructive turn. It began in Wittenberg with Andreas Karlstadt, one of Luther's disciples. He condemned images of Christ and the saints as a violation of the first commandment, and he persuaded the city council of Wittenberg to remove all images from the churches of the city. Luther, who was away from Wittenberg at the time, countermanded the order when he returned, and he openly broke with Karlstadt over it. Not in Lutheranism, therefore, but especially in Calvinism, did self-conscious, comprehensively destructive programs of iconoclasm break out. Those programs were especially thorough in some cities of Switzerland and in the whole of Scotland. By the third quarter of the 16th century, the French Calvinists, the Huguenots, had gained considerable strength in France, and they there set about destroying images in churches everywhere they were able. The Mediterranean world of Italy, Spain, and Portugal was virtually untouched by this movement, which explains why the veneration of sacred images was a non-issue at the Council of Trent until after the arrival of the French during the Council's last period. The French brought with them a demand that the Council issue a decree declaring sacred images not only legitimate, but useful for instruction and devotion. Because of French insistence, the Council at the very last moment complied and produced its famous decree. The decree was so late in coming from the committee responsible for formulating it that the Council had time only to rubber stamp it without even a moment's time to discuss or debate it. In any case, the decree is a resolute affirmation of sacred images. Let the churches and other places be adorned with them. In recent decades, the decree has been widely discussed by our historians. They have tended to focus on the decree's stipulation that all lasciviousness and sensual appeal be avoided in sacred images, and that, if the images are about biblical persons or events, that they be true to the sacred texts. These provisions are certainly important, and they had an impact on art, on artists, and on their patrons. The best-known case concerns Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. After the Council, in an attempt to observe the Council's decrees, Pope Pius IV had the frontal nudity in that famous fresco overpainted. That is the Last Judgment that we see in the chapel today, even after the recent restorations. Nonetheless, similar instances of mutilation are few, even in dioceses with bishops zealous to implement the reform of Trent. We must remember, despite the decree's warning about possible abuses, which in fact consist of only a few words in a long decree, the overall message of the decree is positive. That message, certainly not unexpected, fell sweetly on the ears of artists and their patrons, and it removed from Catholic lands a threat that had devastated others. It was in keeping with the sacramental principle distinctive of Catholicism that the spiritual is mediated to us through material signs. When the political, military, and religious scene had more or less settled by the late 16th century, the two most productive centers of art, Italy and Flanders, were securely in Catholic hands. And by that time, Spain had begun to emerge as another important center, also firmly in Catholic hands. In the early 17th century, as artistic taste moved gradually into the Baroque era, artists became ever more prone to reveal ever more human flesh. Think of Caravaggio and the Carracci. No artist of the time revealed more flesh or gloried more in the beauty of the human body than Peter Paul Rubens, a devout Catholic who attended Mass daily. Of the era, the Jesuits' preferred artist. In its decree on the sacrifice of the Mass, the Council gave voice to a general principle that underlay its approach to worship. That statement, though less commented upon, is perhaps just as important for revealing the Council's stance regarding the sensuous. It says, quotation, "Since human nature is such that it cannot raise itself up to the meditation of divine realities without material aid, Holy Mother Church has for that reason provided certain things such as symbolic blessings, lights, incense, vestments, and many other ritual objects, by which the majesty of this great sacrifice is enhanced, and the minds of the faithful are aroused by such visible signs of religious devotion to contemplation of the high mysteries hidden in it. This passage and the decree on images professed a close relationship between the corporal and the spiritual, and were thus able to justify and therefore to promote the material enhancement of divine worship, a feature that strikingly set Catholic worship off from most of its Protestant counterparts. They moreover promoted two profoundly different cultural appreciations that would persist through the centuries. More was at stake, in other words, than theology. Or perhaps better put, theology in this instance had profound repercussions on culture. Number 3, the Council enhanced the prestige of the papacy and increased its authority. The Council of Trent had two principal aims: reform of the Church to make it more pastorally effective, and affirmation of those Catholic teachings that Protestants rejected. The Protestant Reformation was a complex movement, and different reformers rejected different Catholic doctrines and practices. There was, however, one doctrine they all rejected without exception: papal primacy. Indeed, no pope almost became their battle cry. Top on Trent's agenda, therefore, should have been a decree on the papacy. But Trent issued no such decree. It did not do so because it could not do so. The bishops and theologians present at Trent disagreed too much about how the papal office was to function. Of course, all those present at Trent believed in papal primacy. Otherwise, they would not have come to a council that was convoked by the Pope and presided over by the Pope's legates. But just how papal primacy functioned, just what its legitimate limits might be, and especially how it related to the council itself, were subjects on which there was no agreement at Trent. Yet it was an issue that simmered beneath the surface almost from the moment the council opened until the moment it closed. It threatened to emerge at a number of different moments and in connection with a number of different problems. The most serious and sustained of such moments lasted 10 months, and it arose in connection with the council's primary reform, getting bishops to reside in their dioceses and to hold only one diocese at a time. There was no lack of clear, even severe legislation on this matter. In its first period, Trent itself passed a strong measure in that regard. But by the time the council met again 17 years later, nothing had changed. The loophole was dispensations from the law granted by the papacy. Popes needed money, and one of their major sources was offerings or stipends offered in return for dispensations. It was the council's attempt somehow to curtail that practice, interpreted by some at Trent and by virtually all in Rome as an illegitimate incursion into the authority of the Holy See, that divided the council into two diametrically opposed factions. That division brought the council to its most severe crisis in its long history, the crisis that lasted 10 months. Moreover, if we focus our attention not on this or that decree of the council, but on the entire corpus, especially of Trent's reform legislation, it becomes clear that the fundamental aim of the council was to enhance the authority not of the papacy, but of the local bishop. Yet after the council, the papacy began to enjoy a new prestige among Catholics and began to exert its authority in new areas of church life. This is remarkable, in that before and during the council, the three popes who convoked the three periods were often blamed and heavily criticized by Catholics for obstructing the council's progress, and indeed for being the main obstacle to the reforms of the church the council wanted to establish. Once the council ended, however, Catholics who during the council had ridiculed it now began to rally around it. Pope Pius IV began to get credit for bringing that fractious body to a successful conclusion. Moreover, in its haste to end the council, the bishops had confided certain tasks to the papacy that it had not had time to complete or even to undertake. Inadvertently, the council handed to the papacy an enlarged job description. As mentioned, the council confided to the papacy the completion of a new index of forbidden books. When Pius IV promulgated the new index a few months after the end of the council, he in effect and probably unwittingly, not only issued a revision of a document created by his predecessor, but established a new papal institution that from that moment forward would enjoy an uninterrupted life in the Church until the middle of the 20th century. As mentioned, the Council also confided to the papacy the revision of the Missal and the Breviary. These two tasks, bit by bit, expanded so as to include other liturgical books, including the Pontifical and the Rituale. Not surprisingly, therefore, in 1588, Pope Sixtus V moved a significant step forward and founded the Congregation of Rites, an action that implicitly but unmistakably redefined the papacy's role regarding Catholic worship. It for the first time provided the papacy with an instrument for ongoing oversight of every possible issue concerning liturgy and the sacraments. That congregation, now with a new name, is still in existence today. When the council ended, it was unclear who had the primary responsibility for the implementation of its decrees. Was it the secular rulers, the local bishops, or the papacy? In the council's documents can be found justification for all three. And in fact, all three not only claimed that authority, but actively and effectively pursued it. Among the three, however, the papacy certainly did not lag behind. As with other institutions in the modern world, therefore, the Church moved into patterns of ever greater centralization of authority. The extent to which that development was directly due to the Council of Trent is debatable. It can, like certain other developments, perhaps best be described as one of the Council's unintended consequences. Let me then, in conclusion, summarize in a single sentence much of what I have tried to convey this afternoon. We must make a clear distinction between Tridentine and the closely related phenomenon, the Council of Trent. Thank you.
So we thank Professor John O'Malley very much for his masterly and so well delivered lecture. Ringraziamo Professor O'Malley per la sua presentazione bellissima e eruditissima. Adesso abbiamo tempo per le domande e Professore O'Malley conosce tutte le lingue, quindi le domande sono benvenute in qualsiasi lingua normale. Io prendo l'opportunità di cominciare con una domanda.
Ah, no.
Non so se il microfono qui. I would like to ask, obviously, a lot of Trent was based on the medieval councils. If I may, yes, you mentioned the Tamezzi on marriage. We have a very similar decree in the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215. And of course, the sacraments have been well covered in many of the medieval councils, and the number 7 first at the Second Council of Lyons in 1274. So obviously that's well known. My question is more, to what extent did the members of Trent, the fathers of the council, to what extent were they aware of the medieval tradition of what they were saying at the council?
It's a very good question. It gives me an opportunity to mention one of the very distinctive features of the Council of Trent, that is to say the role of the theologians. First of all, the theologians played a very role integrated right into the very operation of the council. So before any doctrinal issue was discussed by the bishops, the legates gave to the theologians a set of questions about the issue, and then in serial fashion, the theologians spoke to the issue, one after the other, sometimes each one speaking for more than 2 hours or so. This one could go on for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, And during this period, the bishops sat there in silence and listened. So the bishops at Trent were, by and large, educated men, but very few of them were educated in theology. Many were in canon law or just in humanistic studies, but very few in sort of formal theology. However, the theologians at Trent were taken from prestigious universities or correlative institutions of their religious orders and were highly trained and knew that tradition. So by one way or another, the bishops got informed about and why you could say this and not that, what the Second Council of Lyons had said, what Fourth Lateran had said, and so forth, what the Council of Florence had said. So they were not ignorant. For instance, the decree on sacred images. One of the objections for the Council to issue a decree on that issue was that it had already been decided at the Second Council of Nicaea. And because the Pope was sort of reluctant to have a decree on this issue, he said, well, why? I mean, this was handled in Nicaea II. Why do we need a new decree? We can just say we reaffirm Nicaea II. Well, so in other words, they were well informed. Not, perfectly, of course, but... Yeah. All right. See, not every language.
When you spoke about the vernacular in the council, particularly in relation to the Vulgate, you used the word reliable as synonymous with authentic. In Dei Verbum in the Second Vatican Council, authentic is used to mean authoritative in the sense of it's the magisterium's role to authentically interpret Scripture. So how does that match up in terms of understanding?
Well, it's a different interpretation of the word authentic. I mean, both of them are okay in there. And with I perhaps minimized Trent a little bit too much, but authoritatively reliable. But it was not trying to say, as I say, there was no definite article. So it's reliable. It's not saying that others are not authentic and so forth. So, but it's a very different. This is a different period, different era, and the word authentic had, since Trent, taken on more weight in ecclesiastical documents. So that'd be my off the top of the head response to that. Yes, back there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You spoke about the fact that the papacy wanted Peter or Constantinople to participate unsuccessfully. Was there any consequence of Trent on the Eastern Church? Not the Catholic Eastern, but the Orthodox Eastern.
Well, that's a little bit beyond my scope. As I mentioned, the Pius IV did try to invite the Eastern Patriarchs and so forth, and they refused to come, which is understandable. And then after the council, of course, there was the what was called the Agreement of Brest and so forth. So that's a development of the council. I really don't know enough about that to say anything about it, because I'd put my foot in my mouth. But not much direct impact on the East. Yes, back there. The last row, yes. Well, it's very interesting. I have a long article on this issue. And one thing I discovered, of course, with the help always of Yedin, is that what happened, so the issue of sacred images was a Northern European issue. And it was first raised in the Synod of Sens, or Council of Sens, in 1527 in Paris. And already, because actually in Paris, iconoclasm had broken out. So in that very important local council issued two decrees on sacred images. One was a long, valid effort to validate them, and then the other was much shorter, also to validate them, but then it mentioned this problem of that superstition and any sort of indecency should be removed. So then we move ahead to 1560-61, when Queen Catherine de' Medici called a colloquy of Protestants and Huguenots and Catholics at Chateau Saint-Germain in her own quarters. And that same issue was picked up in a decree that came from the Sorbonne, from the theologians at the Sorbonne. And that sentencia, that position paper, you might say, was brought to Trent by Cardinal Charles de Guise. And several of the French theologians at Trent had worked on it. They were at the Sorbonne at the time, so they knew the decree. So all at once, at the very end of the council, into the lap of Charles de Guise was dumped that issue, the issue of indulgences, the issue of fasting, several other issues and so forth, which they had to complete in a day and a half. And what the final the decree of Trent is really kind of a paraphrase or a shortening of the decree from the sentencia of the theologians at Saint-Germain. So it goes back to the 1527, then 1560, and it's picked up again at Trent. So it's an important part of the decree, but it's there is this myth in art historical circles, for instance, that Michelangelo's Last Judgment was discussed at length at Trent, and it was there decided that it was indecent and it's public in its exposure of frontal nudity and so forth. The fact is, as far as I know, no work of art was ever discussed at Trent, and this decree on sacred art was never discussed by the council. It received it at the very last moment. By that I mean the afternoon before the council ended. Simply rubber stamped it, and off it went. So that issue of the sensuous nature of images, it's important, but I think it's been too much grabbed on recently by art historians and so forth. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Lei ha detto che è un mito, l'idea che Trento fu un concilio tutto uniforme, unito, che non ci furono discussioni. Ma è vero quello che si dice, che ci furono dei veri e propri circoli, cioè delle correnti che si scontrarono, per esempio tra riformatori e conservatori. Sono delle semplificazioni che a volte si applicano anche ai concili più recenti, diciamo, perché per esempio c'è una figura, quella del Cardinal Paul, che alcuni dicono che era il centro di una corrente più tollerante, più riformatrice. Se queste distinzioni sono reali o sono anche queste dei miti?
No, è reale, perché c'erano delle dispute, delle varie posizioni a Trento. Cardinal Paul, la sua posizione a Trento è stata, secondo me, esagerata, perché è partita da Trento dopo la prima settimana della discussione su giustificazioni, e quella discussione durava per 6 mesi, e lui si è andato via. Una persona più importante in quello riguardo è il Cardinal Seripando, Girolamo Seripando, e lui, sì, la sua posizione non era troppo distante dalla posizione di Lutero, dei riformatori, si dice.
In brief, what will you say are the influences of this myth in some of the reactions of the Council Fathers or the theologians in the Second Vatican Council?
Well, which myth?
Because I'm just looking at the different kinds of myth, and was, thinking that many of them or some of them would have actually informed some of the reactions, both on the part of the progressives or on the part of the conservatives.
Well, at the Second Vatican Council, the Council of Trent is often cited, and no one, whether conservative or progressive, whatever you want to call those people, the majority or the minority, they all wanted to affirm the Council of Trent. But the question then was how to interpret the Council of Trent. So this was the issue. So again and again, the Council keeps saying you're teaching in conformity with the previous Catholic tradition, especially the Council of Trent and Vatican I. We say such and such and such and such. So in that level, and as Professor Tanner mentioned, I mean, Trent was in reality and then again in myth seen as having determined and set the whole set of Catholicism from the 16th century up into the present. And no one wanted to sort of disregard it or say it was not proper. How are we doing?
One or two or three more, and then we must.
Father Rossi.
Professor, you spoke about bishops and theologians, about the ambassadors. So there were many influences. I suppose that some bishops were also theologians.
Few. They knew their limitations. Many of them were, as I said, canon lawyers. But relatively few were what we call professional theologians, except those who came from religious orders. Yeah.
My question was, can you say something more precise on the influence of the theologians who came to have to be still more precise? In the first session, can you read something of the importance of the Jesuit theologians, or why they're not so important?
Well, all I can say is that it's hard to exaggerate the importance of the theologians at the Council of Trent. And as I say, they were integrated into the function of the Council in a way very different from the way they were not integrated in the Second Vatican Council. In the Second Vatican Council, the bishops took up these issues, pronto, in their own hands. There were theologians on the commissions, but the theologians were told that they could speak only when spoken to. And, of course, they contributed a lot. They were extremely important. But at the Council of Trent, they were part of the actual functioning of the Council. Every doctrinal issue began with the so-called Congregation of Theologians. So they were extremely important. Seti Pando was, of course, extremely important through all three of them. There were two Jesuit theologians at Trent, Lainez, who became second general of the society, and then his companion Salmeron. And the Jesuits like to think that they sort of set Trent on its way. It's a little exaggerated. No, they were important at Trent, but they were important among others. And Lainez especially made a few crucial interventions, as others did too. So extremely important. I don't want to dismiss them, but don't want to exaggerate their importance and influence either. Yes, let's be the last one.
Father, you bring out very well the distinction between Trent and Trinity. And almost the picking up of momentum as it sort of moves off maybe the intent even of the Council of Trent. What are the implications as we now come to understand it better of Trent, what they intended, and how to evaluate or to go back and look at the practices, etc., that pick up off that? I mean, it's a general question beyond Trent.
Well, I mean, one thing for me is to look at Trent, and Giuseppe Alberigo often made this point, that Trent was much more open on different issues than we give it credit for, and that happened after the Council. So I think that's very enlightening and helpful. Also, it's helpful to see, how history works. That we make decisions, there are these unintended consequences. There's a momentum that picks up and goes in its own direction that has little or much to connection with the original impulse. So as I say, the Tridentine, as an adjective, Tridentine, and a closely related phenomenon, the Council of Trent. There's no Tridentine without the Council of Trent, but they are distinct realities. And I think that's important for us. And with the Second Vatican Council, with all these church issues, it's make a distinction. And I think for us, what's important is to try to get back as best we can with all our limitations, to what the original intent of these councils were. I mean, the Second Vatican Council and the Council of Trent itself. I say the vernacular liturgy is a good, very concrete example of something. But here, how it was interpreted and what the council actually said, and it was basically a non-issue at Trent, which is surprising, I think, to most people. Thank you very much.